Questions over whether Canada and its allies would send tanks to Ukraine persist after Ottawa announced additional support to the war-torn country. During a surprise visit to Kyiv today, Defence Minister Anita Anand said Canada will send an additional 200 armoured vehicles to Ukraine to help its defence against Russian attacks. Allies, including Germany, have been wrestling with whether to send tanks to Ukraine. Germany is facing pressure to not only send some of its Leopard 2 tanks, but to allow other countries that operate the same tanks to do the same. The Canadian Armed Forces has 112 Leopard 2s in use. Joining us to discuss the situation is Dr. Rob Huebert, defense expert and associate professor at the University of Calgary. Dr. Huebert, welcome to Forum Daily.
Always nice to see you, Nathan.
So the defense minister recently announced Canada will donate some 200 Rochelle-made Senator armored personnel carriers to Ukraine. What is the significance of this announcement?
Well, significant in the context that the equipment itself is necessary. The of war, and we've seen this before both in Georgia and Chechnya, is to wear out the capability of its end. So in other words, it doesn't go for the overwhelming strategic victory or the flashy sort of shock and awe that Western forces often use. And so I think one of the critical things, if the Ukrainians are ultimately to persevere, they are going to have to be resupplied. So therefore, this resupplying of them is critical for any possibility of success. Significant is that we seem to see within the Canadian government at least a willingness that it has to resupply going. Of course, we'll see for certain whether or not it goes beyond what is just being announced.
And jumping off that point, allies are debating sending tanks to Ukraine. So for viewers back home, before we jump into the tank issue, so what is the difference between an armored personnel carrier and a tank?
Well, the main element in terms of the modern battle, of course, is a tank carries a much heavier armament. And so therefore it's able to hit a lot harder. It tends to have more protection. And so tanks, even though some people said that they were a thing of the past, we've seen the modern battlefield, at least the way the Russians fight wars today, is essential in terms of either being defeated if you don't have enough, or being able to sustain yourself against the Russians. And so it's the hitting power that really is at the heart here. And so therefore, some people say it's an offensive weapon system as opposed to defensive, though to be perfectly honest, I don't quite know what that means.
So I guess jumping off that point there, you say offensive system, but what is actually stopping Germany from sending its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine and allowing other allies to send their Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine as well?
Well, there's two factors. There's the first obvious official one that the German officials are quoting, and within German policy, there is a real heightened concern about providing weapon systems that can be seen as offensive. And this, of course, goes back to their legacy from the Second World War and their desire to be seen only as a defensive nation. So that's the first part of it. But the second part is, of course, once again, is we come back to the point: if the Russians are going to be defeated, if the are able to hold them from current gains and possibly even push them out of the Crimea and eastern Ukraine, they need to have this type of capability. And so that the fear, if the Russians understand this, if the Russians start seeing the Germans providing arms that can in fact see to the need, the question then becomes, well, what do the Russians do in response to that? And so there's a fear that such a push, with the obvious ramifications that they carry for a possible Ukrainian sustainment and ultimately victory, might mean in terms of Russian reaction. And I think that's the bigger one that the Germans are really concerned about.
Lots of food for thought for sure for the Germans there. I want to jump back to an announcement last week about air defense. And again, we've only got about a minute here, so just touching on it. But the federal government's purchase of a U.S.-made air defense system has raised some questions, given that the CAF has been without a primary air defense system since about 2012. So where do things stand for air defenses here? And again, about 40 seconds.
We don't. I mean, you answered your own question, and in terms of how this seems so bizarre. Is we can appreciate that this is important for the Ukrainians, and good on the government for giving it, but it illustrates the fact that our government has been so ill-disposed to actually take our own defense serious.
So that's a concerning thing. And in about 10, 15 seconds here, what are you watching for next after the announcement of these 200 armored personnel carriers?
Well, if we sustain it, if we keep going, I mean, the critical thing that the Ukrainians need is a Canadian government that will keep the pipelines going along with the other NATO allies.
Lots to watch for and lots to keep monitoring as the conflict in Ukraine continues. Dr. Rob Huebert, thanks for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Always my pleasure, Nathan.
See you next time.